Okay. Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm Diana Ingram. I'm the executive director here at Hill Center at the Old Naval Hospital. And it's such a pleasure to welcome you to our Arts and Cultural Center. I see some of Professor Sassoon's students, so thank you for making the trek from Georgetown University. We have lots of exciting things coming up. Please be sure to check our website. I'll just mention we are welcoming the Pulitzer Prize winner for poetry, Marie Howe, on September 25th, which is quite a coup. Thank you, executive producer Marianne Brownlow and Kyle Dargan. Bill Press returns with Talk of the Hill with best-selling author Lynn Olson later in September. And At Issue, a brand new public affairs strand, comes back October 8th, looking at the politicization of the FBI, with correspondent Devlin Barrett, a colleague of Benjamin Applebaum's, I believe, and former FBI agent Michael Feinberg. Tonight, however, please join me in welcoming Joseph Sassoon, discussing his book, The Sassoons, The Great Global Merchants and the Making of an Empire. We are blessed to have Benjamin Applebaum, a lead writer on economics and business for the New York Times. He writes about public policy, although he seems to tackle a whole range of different issues. One of his current books, The Economists, False Prophets, Free Markets, Fractures. No, I got that wrong. False Prophets, Free Markets, and the Fractures of society. I mean, that's sort of a totally different twist on economics, and it's available following the conversation from our friends at East City Books, who also have copies of Professor Sassoon's book, and both authors have graciously agreed to sign the books following the presentation. The format will be a conversation, an interview, and followed by Q&A. So we're recording this for our YouTube channel, so I'll ask you if you have a question to raise your hand, and Marianne will come by with the microphone, and just wait for the microphone before you ask your question. Take a moment, please, to turn off your mobile devices. I can't think of a better person to convene this conversation than Benjamin Applebaum. I think the line I really appreciate in his bio is that he examines what is broken and illuminates paths that might lead to a better place. I think we can all agree with that. So thank you for being here, and thank you for being here.
So we're going to talk this evening about your book, The Sassoons, which tells the story of a remarkable family, and one that I first encountered some years ago. I was in Shanghai, taking a tour of what had been the Jewish ghetto there during World War II, and learning about the history of the Jewish community there. And the name Sassoon figures very prominently in the story of that community. And indeed, in Shanghai's larger history, there are buildings on the waterfront to this day built by members of that family. I had a drink in one of them, now called the Peace Hotel. Some years after that, in Hong Kong, I again encountered this name, in Mumbai as well. Wherever you are in that part of the world, it seems you come across the legacy and the monuments and buildings built by this extraordinary family. And so when this book landed in my inbox with an invitation to come talk about it, I was really intrigued because I didn't know too much of the story that lay behind those buildings. I just knew that it must be pretty interesting for one family to have left so many fingerprints on the modern world. And so I was fascinated to read the story in this book and to learn more about it. And I hope this evening you'll all have a chance, if you haven't done your homework beforehand, to learn something about that story. So what we're going to do is the professor is first going to talk a little bit about that story, tell us a little bit about it. Then I'm going to ask him some questions, and then you all are going to have an opportunity to ask him some questions. So here we go.
Thank you very much for having me here, and thank you for the introduction. So I'm going to talk for about 25 minutes, and then just give you a little brief on the story. It really, usually when you read stories like that, it tends to be rags to riches. But in this case, there was riches decline, you know, which is a weird form of success. It is really the story of the survival of an immigrant family, what it meant to be Jewish refugees in foreign land, and their desperate need to be accepted, first in India and then in Britain. It all started in Baghdad, and this is very, very important because the connection to Baghdad is really critical, especially throughout the first 2 generations. They identified as Baghdadi Jews throughout the first 2 generations, whether in India or in Britain. They continued to be holding the tradition, the customs, the food, everything from Baghdad. Started with the founder, David Sassoon. His father actually was the representative of the Sultan. So Baghdad in that time, in the beginning of the 19th century, was a province in the Ottoman Empire. And the Sultan would appoint a governor and a tax collector. David's father was the tax collector. Governors came, governors left. Some were good, some were not. And at the end of 1820s, a corrupt governor comes and a lot of problems erupt. I don't want to go right now into the story. As a result, the father takes David, the oldest son, and they escape to Basra in southern Iraq and then to Bushehr in Iran. The father died, and David makes a really critical decision, which is kind out of the norm, and that is to go to India. A lot of these families went to different parts of the Gulf where Arabic was the language, the customs were the same, and yet he chose to go to India. Based on conversations that he had with British merchants, diplomats, that in India no one really cares about religion or anything. They care about only the business. So just a little bit background on him because it's important. He had, with his first wife, he had 4 children. His wife died very young. He remarried and had together 10 children. So in altogether 14 children. And this is really important because they created the cornerstone of this, what is called later on an empire. When he arrived in India, he really knew nothing. He knew no one. And he started from absolutely scratch. Remember, neither he or his father were in the trading business. They were basically government officials and tax collectors. So he arrived in, David Sassoon arrived in Bombay around 1831, 1832. And I think one of the main decisions that he made is to identify with the British colonial power. You have to remember, as an immigrant family, there was nowhere to turn to. There was one superpower at the time, and that was Britain. So he identified with them. In 1853, he was granted the became a British national. One of the weird things that you read this, that he swore allegiance not only to a country or a government, but also to a corporation, because at the time, the East India Company was controlling India. He didn't learn English. He never learned English. And in fact, later on in his life at that period, all his speeches were in Arabic. What made me do this work? I tend to work on different areas in the Middle East, authoritarianism. I discovered this hidden archive. And I say hidden, it's not because it's impossible to get, but because of the complexity of the language. So if you look at this, this is actually 3 languages. It is Baghdadi Jewish dialect, which means Arabic, written in Hebrew letters. So you need to know all 3 languages in order to decode. The other part of it, which was even more complicated, there were no paragraphs. It goes on from one subject to another. And it is thousands and thousands of these documents were accumulated, and the family somehow kept them. Very briefly, one of the things that I was very excited in writing the book is discovering the 4th character here you see, which is Farha, who becomes Flora. She was, as far as I found out, the only CEO in the 19th century throughout the world. She truly run a big global business. David Sassoon, I mentioned, his first son, Abdullah, who later on, they're all anglicized their names, and his became Albert, and I'll talk about that for a second. His second son, Elias, who at a very young age was sent to Shanghai and to start the business with China. One of the things that took place really, that there were events that were taking place that outside the control of the family, world events. So in 1839, the Opium War began. China was open to foreigners. Opium became a legal commodity to trade. And I talk a lot about it in the book. The sons, whether Abdullah, whether Elias, or all the others, they were trained from a young age. All the boys were sent back to Baghdad to learn the language, to gain experience, and this became a cornerstone of the training. Farha, I will talk about her, and then from a different later stage, Victor, that is in Shanghai, as you just heard. Remarkably, there wasn't one trade or event that changed everything. For David, it was step by step. There were 2 things from an economic point of view that he understood: networks and information. Nothing has changed. And he built a tremendous network through his sons and sons-in-law, and later on, information gathering from all correspondence throughout the Ottoman Empire, throughout Persia, and then later on in Asia. Huge success. This is a map that shows you literally 30 years after he arrived, and look at the incredible spread in Asia, all correspondence. You could see 3 red stars. These are the main hubs. The first hub was Bombay, the second hub was Shanghai, and then London in the 1860s. Tremendous connection to all those places. In fact, one competitor put it in the early 1860s, and I quote, silver and gold, silks, gums, spices, opium, cotton, wool, and wheat. Whatever moves over sea or land feels the hand and bears the mark of Sassoon and Co. One important thing that really was unique, when I started looking at their trade books, the family added a tax, a charity tax, a quarter of 1% to every trade they did. Irrelevant of whether the trade was profitable or not. Now you could say a quarter of 1% is not a lot, but if you're doing 1,000 trades, it accumulates, and as a result, a huge amount of money was accumulated for charities. Synagogues were built in India, in China, but it wasn't just about a religious aspect. If you go today to Mumbai, Bombay, there is in the center the David Sassoon Library. If you go to Pune, which is about 3-4 hours from Mumbai, there is the Sassoon Hospital. And there are many other aspects of the Sassoons that were serving the general population. Keep going. 1864, David Sassoon died. He left a will appointing Abdullah as the main person. And here begins a different part of the story, that the second son, Elias, whom you saw, refused to accept that will and said that he has contributed a lot to profits and therefore it's only fair to be 50-50. 3 years of negotiation did not result, and by 1867, 3 years after the death of David, we end up having two Sassoons companies, David Sassoon and Co. and E.D. Sassoon representing Elias Sassoon. The two compete head to head throughout the next 20-30 years and hurt each other in more than one way. For really, apart from Abdullah, the only other recognizable personality who had a huge impact was Farha, who ran the business after Abdullah's death. And there is a whole chapter on her. Albert Sassoon was more intrigued as some members of the family were beginning to move to England, and he himself moved to England in 1872 after he was knighted. And that was when he changed his name and it became Sir Albert. Actually, interestingly, in all the correspondence, he kept saying Abdullah. He was presented with a large honor at a gathering at the city, and it says this is the first time that an East Indian merchant has been admitted to the honor, highly prized by its possessor and much coveted by the aspirants to city fame. It is the first that the freedom of City of London has been presented to a Jew. We're talking about really 40 years after their escape from Baghdad, so it was truly a remarkable ascent. One of the interesting things in their family motto, that there was never an issue about religion. It was all based on one thing and one thing only, and that is trust. Can you trust your counterpart? In all the correspondence of over 100 years, the issue of religion or identity never comes up. It's always, can you trust the counterpart? There are a lot of symbols here from Baghdad. You could see the palm tree as, you know, in the center, and it is, as you can see, candide et constante, truth and honesty. What was taking place also at that time, more and more members of the family were moving to England. Marriages to European families began to take place. I can read later on, if there is time, about one of the marriages to the daughter of a Rothschild, which is quite fun to look at. And then with this change, it came the big houses. This is Aline de Rothschild. They always had big houses. The first house is Sanssouci in Bombay, which is now the Messina Hospital. It's an absolutely huge building. I could never understood when I was reading the local paper that they had one party for 1,100 people. I could not understand how you can fit 1,100 people, but then when I went there, I realized that it was big. In the last few years of David Sassoon, he moved to Pune because it's less humid, and that's the house which later on they expanded and then turned it into a hospital. And when they came into London, these are some of the houses. Again, I'm happy to read something about these houses if there is time. I think that it was the beginning really of the decline that was taking place, change of attitudes, work ethic. David and Abdullah and Elias all worked 12 hours, 14 hours, 6 days a week. And then there is a letter later on in the 1880s. We went to the office at 11 in the morning in London. At 1, we went to the club for lunch. And at 3, we went to the horse race to bet on horses. And that tells you all the story. This is now not only houses in London and just in places like Brighton, but now you have to have an estate in Scotland for hunting, fishing, shooting, and that really tells you the whole story. Quickly to switch, this is what Victor built, and you were talking about it. The Bund building, he was the first one to build a skyscraper in Shanghai. It's now called it was the Peace Hotel. It's the Fairmont Peace Hotel. It's a beautiful, beautiful building still there. Victor was an interesting personality. He hobnobbed with all the famous people, Charlie Chaplin. Marlene Dietrich was his girlfriend. He has wonderful diaries that are really quite a lot of fun to read. He was a true bon vivant. But of course, in 1949, things started going south in China, obviously with after Pearl Harbor, but then in 1945, when the war ended, then the Civil War began, and then in 1949, the Chinese nationalized all foreign assets without exception. I'm going to stop here, and maybe we'll come back to one or two things.
Good, excellent, thank you. Maybe one place to start is with a phrase in the loyalty oath that David Sassoon took. You had it up on the screen. I don't know if you want to put it back up there for a second, but he is described in that loyalty oath. Yeah, there it is. He's described as a Jew merchant. Both words, Jew and merchant. You've talked a lot about the family as merchants, and I'm curious whether you think of this as a Jewish story, and if so, what that means. What did it mean that he was a Jew as well as a merchant?
One of the interesting aspects, actually, that Mumbai as undeveloped compared to today was extremely cosmopolitan. There is correspondence with a guy who was a priest but interested in history, and they used to meet and study different texts. Now, the priests didn't speak any Arabic, but they spoke partly in Old Hebrew and Aramaic, and so David Sassoon spoke Arabic and Persian, Turkish, and Hebrew, but didn't learn English. I think it's remarkable also. The other aspect that I don't think the religion was, he was very religious, but it wasn't dominant. So he worked very closely with a lot of Indian families. The Tatars were actually, the relationship with the Tatars is far, far from the beginning. And he helped them on some charity causes and vice versa. And there is coordination that both the Sassoons and the Tata would open schools for girls in Bombay in 2 different locations. So I think the story is really not just about religion. It's more about India did not put that much focus at the time on it.
We see a pattern across the world where merchants tended to come in this sort of pre-modern period from minority communities, close-knit minority communities that could form networks based on trust, exactly in the way you describe. Armenians, Jews, Persian merchants in India. This pattern repeats again and again. They were people who, in some sense, the role was needed by their societies, and they were the people who were willing to remain in that sort of confined role. And I'm curious, the historian Yuri Slezkin has argued basically that the 20th century is the period in which people stopped needing Jews to play that role. And so, Jewish identity in that sense begins to evaporate. And I'm just struck by how well the Sassoons fit that description. This is a family that is Jew merchants through much of its history, and then gets to England and suddenly becomes just English.
Not only English, but refused to admit their connection to anything, to being Jewish or being Baghdadis originally. Mm-hmm. The most famous is a poet, Siegfried Sassoon, that found out only at the age of 13 that he's Jewish, that his father is originally from Baghdad, because it was a no-no to talk about it. And the only reason he discovered, his father actually died, and when they were burying him, he and his brother couldn't understand, quote unquote, why these weirdos were chanting in a weird language, wearing weird stuff. And so it really come to the forefront. They really did not want to, this aspect of Oriental also, as you get to the 4th generation, suddenly some of them started, so if you, in that family emblem, they really wanted to take out, they took out the Hebrew, and they started saying that actually they came from Spain, because Spain is in Europe and it's a little bit more prestigious than Baghdad.
That they were Marranos, or that they had been Spanish Jews? Okay.
Yes.
Huh. Interesting. And of course, it's the Hebrew part that encapsulates what you describe as the core of the family's principles.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. I want to come to the perhaps most uncomfortable part of the story, which is
the opium.
Yeah, they were, to pardon the term, drug dealers on a truly grand scale. I'm curious what you can tell us about how they understood that role, how they understood what they were selling, and what its effects were.
Yeah, I dealt with it head on in the book, really, and didn't miss a beat on the fact that it was a problem. But I actually, the more I dug into it, I also began to understand the circumstances. And the circumstances that the British wanted to treat it as a regular commodity. That was the way they treated it. No different from cotton or spices in any way or manner. I'm not trying to justify anything, but I'm just putting the picture. And the picture is the following, which I shocked because I really didn't know all these things. Until 1907, you could go to any pharmacy in New York or London or Paris and ask the pharmacist for opium, for headache or stomach pain. It used to be quoted every day until World War I in the Financial Times as no different from commodity as gold and silver. In 1895, because of religious pressure in the British Parliament, a huge committee was set up. 4 years investigated. I have 6 volumes of the Opium Committee. At the end of it, it said that we could not come to any conclusion that basically opium is more harmful than alcohol. And if you want to ban opium, we're going to have to ban whiskey. And you can imagine the reaction at the British Parliament about banning whiskey. So it really was an incredible, how they managed to put it in such a way. And doctors after doctor, they came in front of them and said, if taken in very small doses, it has the same impact as you're having 1 glass of whiskey. I'm not a medicine person. I don't know whether it's true or not, but I am just telling you what the committee. They did not worry about it. I mean, and that's what my criticism is in the book, that when things began to be more clear, when there was pressure, there was no correspondence of saying, are we doing the right thing? And that did not come up. And I criticized that harshly in the book for not coming up.
I mean, you tell the story very clearly in the book, and part of the story that you tell is in the period when there are starting to be more and more accounts of the horrors of opium abuse in China in particular. They mount this huge lobbying campaign to ensure that the British government doesn't crack down. It honestly, reading it really felt to me a lot like reading about the Sacklers, who did this with opioids, 100 years later. There's obviously this period when it's just normal, but then there's this uncomfortable period where there are some pretty credible people saying, hey, this thing is not being used in moderation, and the family is still fighting to, it's sort of, how capitalism goes off the rails.
I mean, from an economic point of view also what happened, obviously opium came to an end with World War I because all governments on both sides of the war needed the opium to use it for medicine, for the soldiers. But even before that, the previous 20 years when there was pressure and Britain began to reduce the exports and impose, every time the local production went up to supply, and in fact, by 1900, there was more production in China than in India. I also found out that opium, there are different levels. It's like wines. There are certain wines that are better than others. Actually, Indian opium is the finest quality. The worst quality you go to, the harsher the implications for the body is. So all those things, again, I'm not trying to justify, but to put it in context.
Yeah. You write at the beginning of the book, you sort of compare the arc of this family to Buddenbrooks, which, if people are not familiar, is a famous German novel about the generations of a German merchant family, and an entirely familiar story of going in a few generations from the merchant prince to the poet who hates rich people. This is a trope because it happens a lot. Do you see it as inevitable, is I guess my question. Do you think that this was just the destiny of any family in this position, is that the fourth generation won't be interested in working hard anymore? Or was there something that brought down this family particularly?
I actually think it is a problem that is common today, and I think in every family. I gave a lot of talks on the book in different parts of the world, and this question is, how does a family that becomes successful? So what happens in the first generation, you have people like David and even Albert working around the clock, building, struggling. But by second generation, you want to have your children live well and benefit from it. The problem is when you get to the third generation, it is really, whether then or now, it is very, very difficult to keep people buzzed in, really want to work very hard. Some families manage to do it, others don't. You need really it's very, very difficult balance between hard work and commitment and between enjoying life and enjoying wealth.
And there's an interesting part of the story. You mentioned it before. There is a member of the fourth generation, I guess, who turns out to be very hardworking, very enterprising, very clever, but she's a woman. And so they decide that that's unbearable. So would you tell us a little bit about Flora, her story, and how that ended?
She's kind of third generation, really. So by age 17, she's a Sassoon. She spoke 6 languages, supposedly could recite most of Shakespeare by heart. She married a Sassoon, which was normal at the time to marry, within the family. And then she announced one point, she asked her husband, who was running basically the whole Far East, whether she could come with him to the office to learn. And he said, fine, but this is not done. She said, well, I'm going to do it. And this raised a lot of, merchants in Bombay complained when they're going there, they're talking business, when they get up and shake hands, what should they do with her? But she sat there and she had an incredible photographic memory. And she kept learning and learning and learning. And when he died, she turned to the family and said, I'm the right one to run it. And none of the people in England wanted to come back and live again in India. And someone had to run the whole Far East and the whole network. And Abdullah, who knew her back from the days in Bombay as her uncle, knew how talented she is and accepted. But then they could never, ever accept, his brothers and other members of the family could not accept the fact that a woman was running the business. And her criticism was, how can a widow with 3 children run a global business? The fact that they were not working, sitting and having fun in London was okay, but she was working. And she was really, truly, she modernized the business. I gave a talk once at a business school about her. She started for the first time to put limits on currency exposure, to put limits on borrowing, all kind of aspect that really was, rather than just, haphazard, she organized it. And the shenanigans against her continued for really 6 years, and then she was fed up, left, and moved to England, took her family. One of her children had fallen at a very young age and was totally disabled. So, but she also traveled a lot with her family, including back to Baghdad, and her son actually wrote a wonderful book about that.
One thing I found interesting, many of the wealthiest Jewish families of this period, including several with whom the Sassoons intermarried, the Rothschilds, the one you mentioned earlier, became the primary bankrollers and in many ways advocates of Zionism. They're the people who funded the settlement of Israel and fought for it politically. And you write in the book that simply was not true of the Sassoon family, that they really, almost to a man and a woman, were not ever really engaged with the Zionist cause. I guess I'm curious why you think that was. Why were they distinct in that way?
I think the first two generations, their connections to Baghdad was so powerful and dominant that I don't think they really thought of anywhere else. I mean, part one. Part two, I think it's quite normal when you are an immigrant arriving in Britain or arriving in wherever. You don't want now suddenly someone to say that there is a third place that should be a place for you to go because of your religion. And yes, there is absolutely no evidence of any support. And I'm talking about from 1870, 1880, there were a lot of emissaries coming from Palestine trying to collect money. Their answer was, we give money only where we live or we have people working for us. We do not give money to charities just anywhere in the world. Whether that was a diplomatic tactic to say no or real, I think it was real to a certain extent because they really created everywhere, whether in China or Indonesia or wherever they were, local facilities that were part of the charity. And you're right. I mean, what is really interesting is it continued throughout. There is the diaries of Weizmann. In it, he talks about how when the British cabinet met to discuss the Balfour Declaration, there was only one Jew in the room, and that one opposed the declaration, and that was Philip Sassoon.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating. This is a family of serial immigrants constantly arriving in new places, making their fortunes there. Obviously, immigration calls to mind some of our modern debates, and I'm curious, in their story, do you think that being in the role of immigrants, being new in new places, was helpful to them? Was it something they had to overcome? How do you think about the role of immigration in their story?
I mean, any immigrant can tell you it's not an easy job, to get to somewhere, to start integrating, to learn life. As I said, David Sassoon never learned English, but made sure that all his children get the top English tutorial. I think their story is very similar to a lot of immigrant families who travel, who work very hard, who are very entrepreneurial and dedicated, both to their family as a unit, but also to the places they are. I mean, David Sassoon actually really, really fell in love with India. One of the things that I didn't mention, in his will, he dictated that this house is not sold for 51 years after his death, i.e. he really wanted his children to live in it for a very long time with the hope that the grandchildren will continue. did not happen. Most of his wishes were not taken place.
I'm curious, perhaps we should have said at the outset, your connection to this story, you're from the part of the family that didn't leave Baghdad.
Correct.
For a long time.
So when David Sassoon escaped with his father, his siblings stayed behind. I'm the descendant of one of those siblings.
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, did learning the history of your family change your understanding of your own story? Did it change the way that you understand where you came from?
It did. It did. I mean, part of it is sad because I remember when I was 12, 13, and my father would want to tell me the story about and the glory about the Sassoons. I used to put my fingers in my ears and run away just to irritate him, and every time it did the trick. When I was writing the book, by then, of course, he died. I was desperate for 5 minutes, 10 minutes to ask questions about different people and different events and what he remember as a child who lived there, because they were in connection with these people. I mean, and the my mother, I grew up with my mother constantly teasing my father, telling him, oh, you come from this big family, you can't do this and this in the house because, you know, you're from the grandees. But it never really I never understood it until writing and putting the story, and I realized how important they were in Baghdad at the time. I mean, a lot of the stuff that about his departure from Baghdad is in the Ottoman Empire archives, because it really, you know, he was an important figure appointed by the Sultan, and throughout their whole lives they lived a very important life. It did change. I mean, you know, I had a lot of regrets, but I couldn't do anything about it. It made me actually, going back to being an immigrant, that really made me understand what they go through, and the struggles, especially when you're trying to build such a global business.
I think we should open it up to the rest of the room. Is there? Yes, there's a microphone.
Let me just give you the microphone.
Yeah.
Hi. Okay. David clearly must have been from an educated, fairly successful family. So I'm interested in before 1800, that end, and then what happened? Was there a dispersal of the family after World War II? So before 1800, what was the history? It must have been interesting.
The family claims that they have been in the same region, the same city for 2,500 years. It goes back to an exile, the Babylonian exile that took place. So there is really a continuity. We don't have a lot of information about great-great-grandparents of David, but you're correct. I mean, he grew up to be appointed the tax collector, or the equivalent of minister of finance in a government, was a very important job. The family did not disperse. My family stayed in Baghdad until the 1970s. So World War II did not change things for those who stayed.
Here, another question.
When the Sassoons moved to England, did they face rejection by the British elite, either for being Jews or for being like not from Britain itself? And how did they deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, this issue really comes up a lot. I think that in a way they faced more anti-Semitism or anti-immigrant in India by the white people than in Britain. And I will tell you one small thing. For example, a very fancy hotel was built in Bombay, and they announced that any non-European will not be allowed to come there for lunch or dinner. And the Sassoon teamed up with the Tatas and built a better and a bigger hotel. And all kind of stories like that come up. There was a lot of attacks that emanated. So part of this hospitality thing, at a very early stage, the Prince of Wales visits Bombay, and he's hosted by the Sassoons. Wonderful stories, but this relationship continues. And a lot in Britain, including Queen Victoria, but a lot of newspapers are very angry, and some, why are you spending, as a Prince of Wales and the future king, time with these foreigners? You know, shouldn't you spend it with the British royalty?
You have a great story in the book about a club in Kolkata that one of the Sassoons wishes to join, an exclusive club. The club refuses him membership, and he informs them that they are his tenants. He owns the land under the club, at which point the club extends membership. What's very interesting is that he allows the club to stay on his land, but he refuses to join it, which I think speaks to sort of, you know, the degree of accommodation reached on both sides and also the residual hostility.
My brother-in-law is a Kurdish Jew from Iraq, from Zakho, and I was always understood that when Israel became a country, that all the Jews were thrown out of Iraq, and that there were, 200 and some thousand Jews, only 2,000 from Zakho who were there from the destruction of the Second Temple or whatever. But I'm just curious how your family was able to stay there.
It was not thrown out, with all due respect. They did not throw them out. It was a voluntary, it's a long, very complicated story. When they were allowed to leave, in the first 9 months, only 8,500 people registered out of a total population of 135,000. And suddenly bombs start exploding. And then that led to more than 100,000 to register to leave. Those who didn't want to leave, like my family, they stayed. Nothing changed, and, continued life as normal. Changed later on for different reasons, political reasons that impacted every citizen.
You can actually find in the New York Times stories from the early 2000s about the very last families that were still maintaining the ancient synagogue in Baghdad at the time of the American invasion. It may now be the case that there's nobody left, but until very recently it was not. 4 left?
4 left.
Okay, there you go.
Hi, Professor. You mentioned intermarriage between the Sassoons and the Rothschilds. I'm wondering, through the historical records, did you see any more about that relationship? And was there possibly any tension between this sort of Western, Eastern heritage, to some extent, how they socialized within British society?
This marriage was actually successful. Other marriages were less successful. He married, there was another marriage with a very well-known family, the Ginsburgs from Russia. That did not go well. And I recently come across, someone has edited her diaries, and there were a lot about, those Orientals, Easterns, blah, 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 about her husband and his family, and how upset she was and angry that she was tricked into marrying him. The one with Aline Rothschild was a very, very successful marriage, and it ended up, but definitely other aspects, yes, came up.
This is presumably part of why they started saying they were from Toledo, right?
Probably.
Yeah.
Is there one final question right here? And then please feel free to stick around and ask questions privately.
Hi, Professor. My question is, how would you characterize the relationship between the Sassoons business and the British Imperial Project? Do you feel like there was connection there? Did they get engaged in political aspects, or was it strictly economics and business?
As far as I know, there was very, very little political activity. I mean, having said that, so the husband of Aline Rothschild ended up being a member of parliament. And there were other people who became, as I said, Philip Sassoon, who became the undersecretary for the Air Force in the 1920s. So they did identify with the British totally. But don't forget something. By the 1900, the other part of the family kept succeeding. The one that stayed in Shanghai with Victor Sassoon. The ones in England were really, their economic influence was dwindling by the day.
I think that brings us to the end of our time.
Yeah, thank you both so much
of course,
for joining us this evening. And
it's
just a reminder that our friends and neighbors East City Bookshop are out there with books by both Joseph and Benjamin. And we'll have a book signing just out there to your right. So please join me in thanking both Joseph and Benjamin.
I just want to say that my book is dedicated to this girl who's here.
They sent me the PDF, but I need to get an actual copy and get you to sign it.